this is the basic technique of getting all your tones. This is the simplest method. Hello, this is BJ from Hearns Hobbies, and today I'm going to be going through a tutorial just to demonstrate how to get the basic 3 tones in your model. So basically how to paint the 3 tones. So you'll see here I've got an example of a skull. So I've chosen a skull because it's got a lot of deep pockets and then also some high areas where I can show you the basic 3 steps. Okay, so the first step is the base color. So I'm going to paint this in the bony color, the ivory. Second step is the shadow tones. So that'll be a wash. And then the third step is the highlights, and that's going to be dry brushing. So they're the really basic tonal techniques. I just enhance your models. So rather than following the instructions on a standard model and then just painting everything in a base color, to add extra depth and detail, we're going to go through these 3 stages. Now, a little bit of theory behind this. So we're working with miniatures, and the thing about miniatures is everything is smaller. Now, with everything being smaller, things shadows and such aren't shown as so because our lighting hasn't been scaled down. So theoretically, if you were to see all the teeth and all the shadows between the teeth and all that, would need a really smaller concentrated light to be able to see that with the natural shapes. And because we don't have that, we have our regular light, which is very diffused. What happens is with diffused light and one single color, you don't pick up on all these finer things. So that's why we have to enhance it with those 3 steps. Okay, so this is an item which has just been primed. I generally prime all the models that I build. Priming basically is using a paint that is going to adhere very tightly with the model. It gives a nice, slightly coarser finish, which means if you're brush painting, it's easier for the paint to adhere. Also, if you're airbrushing, it'll stick better. And then from here, we'll do the base coat. So I'm going to mix up some paint here. I'm doing acrylic paints. This is on a wet palette, so I highly recommend a wet palette for any acrylic paint for brush painting. It gives you a lot more control and allows mixing very easily. And let's get started. So here I've got my mag visors. I tend to need to use mag visors these days. It's just the way my eyes are. So let me just pop these on. Okay, so let me just prepare the palette. So we're going to go with our pretty common colors. So we'll always put a black here. May not need it, but I'll put it there anyway. Okay, so black, that's going to be acts as the total shadow. And then we go to white. So white represents total highlight. Actually, I might do a bit more of that because we're going to be using quite a bit of that to make our ivory mix. And then from pure white to get our ivory color, we're going to use a touch of brown. A little bit there. And a touch of yellow. Right, so I've got a touch of yellow right here. Alright, so the paints I'm using are the Scale75 Artist range of acrylics, but this sort of method will work with any acrylics and really any paint. I mean, if you use oils or you use lacquers, you just won't be using this wet palette. You'll just be mixing them on a dry palette. Okay, so let's mix up our base color first. All right, so we're going to start with our white. This is our base here, so we'll spread it out there. Now we want to tone that with a touch of brown. We want the smallest amount because dark colors influence white quite heavily. You see how that was the smallest touch, and it's already got this light beige coming through. Okay, so pretty happy with that as it is, but I just want a touch of yellow in there to get our ivory tone. All right, so I'm happy with that. So there's your sort of bony color. Now you can play around with this mix any way you like. You might want it more orange, you might want it whiter again. you might want it a touch pink to represent that it's still got a bit of flesh stuck to it. So that's open to interpretation. But this is really to demonstrate what you do with any part. So this is simply the base color stage. Okay, so I just added a bit of water just to make it a bit more brushable. Because depending on what paint you use, it can come out very heavy. Now this particular artist type paint is highly pigmented, so it gives you a lot of control. All right, so pretty happy with that. I'm just going to blot off the excess off my brush there. And we start with the base coating. Okay, so this is just simply painting the whole thing in that base color. Okay, so do it fairly quickly here. Now I'm using a big wide brush at the moment, but this all depends on the part that you're painting. So again, just think of this as just one item. It can be a really small part, and then you use a small brush, of course. But larger parts, it's a lot quicker if you just use a larger brush to cover everything. Okay, so basically all we want to do is paint this so that everything has the base color on it. And just make sure we get into all these nooks and crannies. Well, I think we're pretty good. Alright, so I'll just give that a little bit of time to dry. Clean off my brush in the meantime in my little jar of water. Now the next step we're going to do is wash. Now the wash is to get all the shadow tones. Alright, so to do the wash, I'm going to use this. This is the Scale75 oil wash. Now the whole idea of using an oil is simply because I've used a water-based paint here. And oil tends to be very easy to manipulate. So with an oil, I'll be able to paint it all over here. And if I want to control it later, say I've got too much on there, I can wipe it off with the oil-based thinner. If I'd use an oil-based paint here, like an enamel, I wouldn't be using this oil straight on, because what will happen is if you wipe it off with the enamel thinner, you'll be wiping off the base coat as well. So if you want to do that, you can use your enamel first, seal it with an acrylic, because an acrylic is impervious to the oil, and then start using your oil wash. But in general, whatever paint you're using here, it's a lot easier to use the opposite or different kind of base. So if you're using a water base, the oil base works on top of that very well. If you use an oil base, you use a water base on top of that, but you don't get the same control. If you want more control, then you'll do oil base, and then water-based clear, and then oil-based wash. Okay, so what is a wash? A wash is basically very thin down paint. Okay, so even this paint here, I think I've done a tutorial before, and I've shown you you can make any one of these into a wash simply by adding a lot of thinner or water to a water-based paint. Now this is basically an oil-based artist paint with a lot of thinner added to it. Okay, so let's just shake it up a bit. Now just make sure this is totally dry, because if it's not totally dry, it's going to interfere. So still some shiny points here. So we'll give it a little bit more time before we apply it. Now with the really thin paint or the wash, what it's going to do is, because it's so thin, it'll settle in all the crevices, so all the deep parts in the detail of your model. And on the high parts, it's not going to pull, it's going to spread away, so it will leave an effect of all the high parts. It'll be less stained, and it'll add more staining on all the parts where it can pull, like inside the eye sockets, the nose socket, and around the teeth. Now what we're going to do after that is, once that's dry, then we can get some cotton wool buds or some wet brushes. They've got a bit of thinner on them, and wipe off some of that excess wash. And then we're going to hit it with the highlight with dry brushing. Okay, so let's have a close look here. Sockets are still a little bit wet. Just blowing a little bit, see if that helps. All right, I might just leave it there for a sec. Just got to go get some cotton wool buds because I might use some of those for adjusting my wash as well. Okay, so here's my cotton wool buds. Just pop those there for the moment. All right, let's have a close look. It's getting pretty close to dry, so let's give it a go and see what happens. All right, so here's my wash again. So I'm using a sort of black wash. This is what they call the dark stains. So it's not pure black, but it's really, really dark. Okay, so I'm just going to get a bit of this out. All right, so let's just add a touch of wash around here. So you see as I'm brushing it on, actually some of that paint is still a bit wet. Let's go around these higher bits here. So if I just put a dot here, actually, let's do a heavier dot. So you see how it's pulling along here. And it's just going to settle in all of the crevices. So that's one way of applying it. You put it all over everything. Or if you want a bit more control to start with, you only concentrate in the areas where you want the wash. So like in the center there, in the sockets.
Good afternoon, Sandy from Hearns. How can I help you? Yes, please.
All right, so that's pretty much coated the whole thing in oil. If you're just doing pin washes, so sometimes we call these pin washes. So a pin wash is basically an extra thin wash, and it's called a pin wash because it's used for putting into panel lines, and it'll run all the way along the panel line. That's why it needs to be super thin. And then occasionally they're also called filters. Now a filter is also a very thin wash. Basically that is when you paint it over it, it acts like a stain. So that's pretty much what it's doing here as well. So it can be known as different things depending on its application and how thin it is. All right, so still a little bit wet there, which is fine. Easiest way, we can still manipulate it while it's like that. So what I'm going to do is just going to dip one of these cotton wool buds into my thinner. I don't want too much thinner, it only needs to be a touch. So I've got a bit too much there, so I'm just rubbing off this excess on a bit of blotting paper. You want it to be just moist for control. If it's too wet, the thinner is just going to go everywhere and just take absolutely everything off. Okay, so as I rub this across the top, see how it's starting to wipe off this wash. And you see how it's always going to leave a slight staining. So that's what's going to happen if you paint the whole thing. If you don't want the whole lot to be stained, then you just need to be a bit more selective with where you apply your wash. Okay, so there you go. So that's with a very quick clean. I'm going to do that again with the other end of my cotton wool bud. So I might notice that the cotton wool bud at the moment is quite stained there. Probably easy to see over here. So we're going to use the other side where it's all clean. All right, just wipe it down again. So here you're going to finesse it a little bit more. Okay, like so. Alright, so that's basically the wash done. You can see how much more definition you have just by doing the wash over the base. And now we're just going to finish it off with the dry brushed highlights. Okay, so what that's going to do is it's going to pick up all those really high sections which the light would naturally pick up. So if you imagine light coming down from the top here, it's going to pick up around the brow, top of the skull, and around the cheekbones. Okay, so we've got our base here. So all the highlight is going to be it's going to be the base mixed with a touch more white. Okay, so we'll just do that here. Again, I'm using this broader brush. So stiff, broader brushes are great for dry brushing. Just wipe off the excess. Okay, so just do our gentle dry brush. So basically you're not applying it like we did on the base coat. It's basically dragging the tips of the bristles across the top. So it's only going to touch across these high areas. And I'm dragging it from the top to the bottom because if you imagine light coming down this way, this means that the paint will only collect on the top of those ridges. And that gives you a bit of a more realistic look. So quite often this is called zenithal painting. Okay, so as we're dragging it across, it's picking up all the individual teeth, still leaving all that wash in the crevices. But giving a ton more definition to everything. All right, that's it, we're done. Okay, so going through that in summary again, this is the basic technique of getting all your tones. This is the simplest method. So what we've done is we've got our standard piece there. We've primed it, getting it ready for painting. Then we've base coated it. So we just mixed up the base coating. The wash has gone on. The wash has been adjusted. So it's pretty much in the crevices where we want it. And then the highlight or the dry brushing has gone over the top. So there are your 3 levels of depth, simplest method. Now, if we get into it more advanced, then we're doing more blends to get all the individual shadow tones. But the 3 is the best to start with, and you can just advance onto smoother blending later on. But as you can see, it didn't take that long. It really emphasizes how this technique gives you all this depth. And it's really simple, and you can use this with any model that you're building. It's not just like skulls and figures and things. You can use this on military models, okay, particularly on the armor of tanks, for bringing up highlights and such. Planes, cars, absolutely used for any model. Okay, you even use these on trains. So if you're a train buff, you use this for helping you add extra definition, and then also if you get into weathering too, but that's another subject again. Okay, so at this stage, if you're happy with it, it's ready to go. If you want to adjust it a bit more, you can always add a little bit more wash if you think that needs a bit more adjusting. So you can go through those steps again, but this is just to show you your 3 basic tones. So you got your dark tone, which is your wash, that's your shadow. You got your base color, which is your mid tone, and then you've got your dry brushed highlights. So there you go. Okay, so thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. So hope you enjoyed that, and happy modeling.